across the globe, this is a uniquely challenging moment. From healthcare workers to those overseeing essential services, to those of us hunkering down at home. At Polar Bears International, we are inspired by the ways people around the world are caring for one another.
And we're committed to doing our part to support you.
So we'll be coming to you live from our homes around the globe, offering a special Spring Tender Connections series. Live broadcasts dedicated to learners of all ages, but especially to students who are learning at home.
Oh, hi! If you're a kid like me, go to Tundra Connections to learn all about polar bears and their favorite food, seals!
Join us each week this spring for something unique. Add Tundra Connections into the mix for your learning during COVID routine. Tune into a lighthearted live chat or enjoy a live stream over breakfast with 2 adorable polar bear cubs in the Netherlands.
Participate in conversations with scientists and take a deep dive into the world of polar bear research and policy. Ask your questions directly and learn from the experts.
Although we are physically distant, we can continue to find ways to be socially connected and come together with our friends, families, and communities.
We hope you'll join us to follow your curiosity and to find a little Arctic inspiration through virtual windows into the polar bear's world.
Hello, everyone. My name is CK Sweat, and I'm coming to you live from Brooklyn, New York. I want to welcome you to this Giving Tuesday Now event, specially organized in response to COVID-19. In these unprecedented times, the critical work of polar bear conservation illustrates how important it is that we come together to save ourselves and our planet. So today, we're going to chat with the Chief Scientist of Polar Bears International, Dr. Stephen C. Anstrup, while we simultaneously raise the funds necessary to support their urgent endeavors. Each month, for just the price of a latte, you can aid the continuing research, education, and action needed to conserve polar bears and their Arctic ecosystem. I'm going to get updates throughout this live broadcast. We hope you will help us reach our goal of 10 new monthly pledge donors today. So now, I'm thrilled to be joined by none other than Dr. Stephen Anstrup himself, Chief Scientist at Polar Bears International. Steve, thank you so much for taking the time to chat with me here today.
Well, thanks for inviting me.
So I have to ask, when did you start researching polar bears?
I first went up to Alaska in 1980, and it was an interesting story. Before I started the polar bear research program, I'd been working in Wyoming on pronghorn antelope and grouse. And before that, I'd worked on black bears. But my supervisor in Wyoming worked for the Denver Wildlife Research Center at the time, and they had been trying to get a polar bear research project off the ground in Alaska, and they asked me if I'd like to go up and do it. And I said, wow. Giant white bears roaming around in an environment that looks like the surface of the moon. What more challenging and exciting work could there be? So I took them up on it and moved up to Alaska.
That's so cool. And you and I have known each other for a couple of years now, but I don't know if you know this about myself, is I was actually born in Anchorage, Alaska. My family moved out when I was a year and a half, so I never got a chance to see any polar bears there. What was it like the first time that you saw a polar bear?
Oh boy, it was something. My first bear was in the spring in March. It was about 35 below zero. It was a really cold day. And we were flying in the helicopter a couple of 100 meters above the ground. And I was just amazed at this environment beneath me, this broken, looked like you could imagine the surface of an eggshell that's cracked but not broken all the way through, with relatively flat surface, but all these corrugations in it. And I was thinking, how could anything survive here? And then all of a sudden, here is this giant white bear, great big male, and it was just an amazing sight. And my first reaction was, holy cow, there's a real wild polar bear. And of course, that's what I'd been looking for. So I don't know why I was surprised, but I have to say that even though I've seen and captured hundreds of bears since then, every one of them still kind of gives me that same feeling.
It's crazy to think that that was 40 years ago. And here we are now, 4 decades later, on a virtual call, trying to raise money for your efforts to save these majestic creatures. And for those of you who are just tuning in right now, thank you so much. If you see that Donate Now button on Facebook, click it, make a donation of any amount. Or if you'd like to go to the Polar Bears International website and become a sustaining donor, we would be so appreciative. We're trying to get 10 of you to sign up for that today. So, Steve, you must have experienced so much in career. What did you see? What did you learn? Take us through what it must have been like to be a scientist on the forefront of this research.
Yeah, it was a really interesting experience, and I have to say it was kind of an up and down or boom and bust experience. When I first went to Alaska, polar bears were recovering from over-harvest, excessive hunting that had occurred in the 1950s and 60s. And by the 1980s, I was able to document that the population had recovered and was thriving. We had lots of big adult males. We had lots of females with good survival of the cubs. And I saw that change dramatically during the years I was there. In fact, if somebody had told me the amount of change I would see, I would, when I first went up there, I would have said, you're crazy. We saw the sea ice changing so dramatically that, I didn't have to be a rocket scientist to realize there was a problem. When I first went to Alaska in the early 1980s, I could stand on the beach in northern Alaska in the summertime in Barrow or Prudhoe Bay. And at the end of the summer, you could usually still see the sea ice. It was right offshore. It was, literally invisible range. And with a pair of binoculars, you might even be able to see a polar bear out there. But now, the latter years of my project, and now the sea ice is so far offshore, it's beyond the curvature of the Earth. Doesn't matter how powerful a telescope you might have, you can't see it. And to me, that's just astounding that in my working career, we could have seen that change. And because polar bears depend on the ice to catch their prey, which is basically 2 species of seals, ringed and bearded seals, the disappearance of that sea ice has major ramifications.
So I'm so curious. For those of you out there who do not recognize my face, don't worry, it's not a famous one. I'm actually a charity auctioneer. This is a gavel if you can see it on screen. And so, Steve, talking to an expert like yourself, what you seem to be describing is what I know as global warming or climate change. Are those the same thing? Are they different? Can you help an amateur such as myself think through the distinction of those two terms that are so prevalent in today's day and age?
Yeah, CK, that's actually an important question. And I think a lot of people get things confused. Climate change is actually the cast of symptoms of a warming world. So sea ice melting is a symptom of a warming world. So it's one of the symptoms of climate change, one of the symptoms of a warming world, as is more droughts, more frequent flood events, higher precipitation in some areas, lower precipitation in others. Those are all the climate change symptoms of us warming the world with our greenhouse gas emissions. It's not climate change that's melting the sea ice, it's a warming world that's melting the sea ice, and the response of the sea ice is in fact a symptom of that warming world.
Both seem absolutely terrifying to me. And I think that's in part why we are doing this work through Polar Bears International. And 2 other terms that I was hoping you could help me understand are the difference between threatened and endangered. My What I've read over the years is that sometimes polar bears are threatened, sometimes they're endangered, and I don't seem to understand what that means. As a scientist, can you help unpack that for me?
Yeah, technically, a threatened species is a species that's likely to become endangered in the foreseeable future, and an endangered species is one that is likely to disappear in the foreseeable future. In the case of polar bears and global warming, it's kind of a moot point because uh, the distinction is that we're trying to apply here between threatened and endangered is on a constant downhill slope. That is, unless we interrupt the warming of the world by halting the rise in greenhouse gas concentrations, the sea ice can only go downhill. So at what point do you say, well, there's not enough habitat for polar bears to be threatened, now they're endangered? Think of it this way, CK. If you and I were standing on the top of a 100-story building and I pushed you off, would you be threatened until you passed by the 10th floor, or are you endangered all the way down?
Well, first and foremost, I apologize for whatever I said to you that inspired you to push me off that building. I must have been running my mouth, as sometimes I want to do. But that's a really evocative way of thinking about it. No, floors 10 through 20, I don't think there's a big distinction between threatened and endangered. I think about you up in Alaska, and I know the state to the degree that I was born there. I've gone back and visited, and you're working as this government scientist, and you're doing all this incredible work, and you're seeing the world change. Why didn't you stay a government scientist? Can you explain why you saw yourself as somebody who needed to join Polar Bears International?
Well, my research team in Alaska at the U.S. Geological Survey had been effective in 2007 in convincing the Secretary of Interior that polar bears needed to be listed. Now, that didn't mean that there weren't other research questions that were important. And in fact, I was a dyed-in-the-wool researcher for about 35 years before I left the USGS. But what I knew in 2010, when I left the USGS and joined Polar Bears International, was that we already knew the answer to the question, what do we need to do to save polar bears from extinction? And that is to get the word out and inspire people to halt the rise of greenhouse gases in our atmosphere. And that answer doesn't require any more research. And unless we do that, the other research doesn't really matter. So I decided it was time to try and focus more on outreach and education. I still am publishing some research, but mainly now I'm focusing on trying to inspire people to change how we live so that we can, in fact, save this magnificent species that I spent much of my adult life learning about. And Polar Bears International is mainly a research and education and outreach organization. That's their goal, is to save polar bears by saving the sea ice. So it was a perfect fit.
And that makes a lot of sense to me, because as a charity auctioneer, I'm thinking through, how do I inspire people to support these incredible causes? And you saw, as a scientist, what needed to be done. And it's changing people's actions, changing the laws, changing the way people see about this. And it strikes me that by supporting Polar Bears International, by, like I said, clicking that donate button on Facebook, by becoming a monthly sustaining member, it's that sort of work that, through your expertise, through the structure of Polar Bears International, that we will start to change the conversation. And just on hopefully a brighter note, how many polar bears are currently in the Arctic right now? Like, can you give us some data that might be heartening?
Yeah, well, actually, that's one thing that is really a promising piece of information. We think there's still about 20 to 25,000 polar bears in the Arctic, and they range across. The range is called circumpolar. That is, it wraps all the way around the globe in the top of the northern hemisphere. Those 19 subpopulations vary in their current status. 4 of them are known to be declining already because of declining sea ice. There's a couple that might be increasing because they live at the very top of the polar bear range, and the sea ice there maybe has been too heavy for too long each year to be ideal habitat. But now the quality of the habitat is improving as the ice melts a little bit. The issue, though, is that many of the populations that may currently be stable, or even some of those that may be increasing, is the fundamental relationship between polar bears and the sea ice and their ability to catch their prey is universal. And so the challenges that we're currently seeing in the 4 populations that are declining will come to all of the populations if we don't halt the warming of the world.
I think about that disappearing sea ice, and I'm guessing that doesn't affect directly other big animal conservation efforts, say for elephants or for rhinos. Can you help us understand a couple more of the differences about how conservation efforts are for polar bears and how they are distinguished from different kinds of conservation efforts?
Yeah, I think that currently our focus may seem to be a little bit different, but actually the threats are very much the same across the world. Thinking about conservation of polar bears has made us think about turning the concept of conservation on its head. It used to be that to save a species, we thought we could build fences or we could hire game wardens to protect the animals that were in a particular area, but we can't build a fence to protect the sea ice from rising temperatures. So that is the fundamental threat to polar bears, and if we don't save the sea ice, we won't save polar bears. Well, there's no sea ice in Africa where rhinos and elephants are endangered. How does this affect them? Well, clearly, those species face tremendous poaching problems right now. And probably if we don't halt poaching soon, there won't be any rhinos or elephants left for global warming to kill. The converse, though, is that their habitat is dramatically changing also. It's drying out. The frequency of rain is becoming less and less frequent. Food availability in many areas is declining. Those things are going to continue just as the sea ice loss for polar bears is going to continue. So if we don't, at the same time we're addressing poaching, if we don't address climate change and the warming of the world, we are going to face a situation where our efforts to save those species now might have been a waste of time because we haven't saved their habitat.
Listening to you outline that was disheartening, of course, and at the same moment, I know from the metrics of Facebook that we're inspiring people through your words, through your expertise to donate. And I want to give a special thank you for Chip and all the other donors out there. But I think what's at the forefront of many of our minds are we doomed? Is there hope for polar bears? Is there hope for us?
In 2010, my colleagues and I published a paper in Nature looking at the future of polar bears. And one of the things that we showed was that there is a linear but inverse relationship between global mean temperature and sea ice extent. So if we stabilize temperature, we stabilize the sea ice. It's not as if we've already passed a tipping point where the sea ice is going to decline irreversibly. We can halt that sea ice. So the answer is we are not doomed. Polar bears are not doomed. But in order to halt the decline of the sea ice in time to save polar bears, we need to act promptly.
And can you outline for us what that action is? Like, what can we do? What needs to be done?
Well, the most important thing is to reduce our reliance on fossil fuels for energy sources, to switch to electric vehicles, to switch to solar and wind generation, and to be more conservative in how we use power. You know, we have basically, ever since the Industrial Revolution, been relying on fossil fuels and not paying the consequences, not paying the full price for the use of those fuels. We've been getting a real bargain, but the bargain has been kind of a bargain with the devil, because an unintended consequence is the concentration of CO2 in the atmosphere rising and warming the world. Now that we know that, I mean, we didn't know that, 150 years ago when we first started relying on fossil fuels, but we know that now. We know what the danger is. And so now the answer is, let's make that transition to renewables. Let's become a totally sustainable economy rather than what we have been for a long time, kind of a throwaway economy.
I think as recent as 3 months ago, a lot of us would have seen that as a Herculean task, this idea of making that transition. But I feel like today we are learning so many new lessons about what we can and can't do because of the coronavirus pandemic. Are there any lessons from the last 2 months, what we've seen around the world, that might help us solve the existential danger that polar bears face?
Yes, I think that's a really good point, CK. We have actually solved major problems, major environmental problems in the past. We solved acid rain. We passed through the Montreal Protocol, international action to reduce the gas concentrations that were damaging our ozone, so that everybody on Earth didn't suddenly become fried by UV light. But the most important thing from the coronavirus that I've taken away is that the recognition of the risks that we all face here stimulated the whole world, essentially, to get together, to take the actions, the social isolation, locking up of businesses at some major expense for many people, but being willing to do it to save many people from the threats of this virus. In the US alone, we've already had 70,000 deaths from the coronavirus, but the estimates are it might have been 10 times that much if we didn't take the actions that we've taken. And if we hadn't taken those actions, the estimates suggest that the cost to our society would have been something like half of our current global domestic or gross domestic product. So huge impacts that we wouldn't have been able to sustain, but our actions showed we could. Now, we don't have to take those kinds of actions to halt global warming, but we do have to take some serious actions. We won't be locking up businesses, but we will be changing the way they get their energy, changing business strategies. And those things actually promise economic boon as opposed to the current transient economic problems that we're facing.
It seems to me that when you talk about acid rain, when you talk about some of the coolants that have been banned, it really was a global community coming together to solve a global problem. And we're seeing that now with that pandemic. And we have to do that. We have to do that with polar bears. So through Polar Bears International, how can we ring the alarm that much more loudly?
Well, that's one of the things that is most valuable about Polar Bears International. You can think of Polar Bears International as kind of the megaphone for the individual out there who's concerned. A lot of people, as you mentioned a little while ago, a lot of people have looked at global warming and the climate change challenges it presents as almost too big to even think about. The coronavirus has shown we can think about them, and that if we do, we can actually make the progress that we need to make. So, but Polar Bears International is here to expand and amplify the voices of people who are concerned about that, people who want to come out of this coronavirus challenge and develop a world in which everybody can be healthier and that we have a rosier future for all of the world.
And I'm seeing now in the donor page that the folks tuning in, like Valerie, thank you so very much. It's this sort of community, this sort of support that I know is going to make such a huge difference. Steve, can you give us some hope? Do you have hope? Like, can you leave us with some hope?
Well, yes, I definitely have hope. And, we looked at the polar bear numbers a little while ago in our conversation, and there's still 20,000 plus polar bears in the world. That tells us that we have enough polar bears out there that we can solve this problem in time to save many of them. And so I think that we don't need to worry about hoping that we have the ability to stop global warming in time to save polar bears. My hope is that people will be inspired to take the action. If we just sit around and do nothing but hope, that doesn't do us any good. Just like in this coronavirus situation, people could have sat back and said, well, I hope I don't get it. Or we could have done what we did do, which is to isolate people, to focus on what we already knew from science about how contagious diseases are spread and what we need to do to slow and stop that spread. We need that same recognition and that same willingness to act. And I'm hoping, my hope, which I still wear every day, is that people will act. We will be inspired to make the changes that we need to make to halt this major threat to the world that we currently love.
And I can tell you right now that people are acting. We've had incredible support here today through the donations on Facebook. We are getting people to the Polar Bears International website to become sustaining members. We're getting closer and closer to our goal of $5,000. And so thank you to everybody who has already donated. And please click that donate now button. Go to our site, become a sustaining supporter. I have to ask you, I love your background. It's so much more colorful than mine. Where are you right now? Where are you at home? What part of the world are we connecting with you right now?
Yeah, I'm in my home office in near Kettle Falls, Washington. And this is a place where I do other chats like this and communicate with media, to write papers, write op-ed pieces. So this is a place that I've been spending a lot of time since I joined Polar Bears International, and especially in the last couple of months when our opportunities to get out and do other things have been somewhat limited. I should say that, whereas this coronavirus has not necessarily impacted my efforts very much, because most of what I do for PBI is right here from my home. But the coronavirus threat has stopped research around the world. The researchers in Alaska that were following up on the work that I did there for 30 years, they had to quit their project and go home this spring because of the risks posed by this pandemic. So this has certainly had an impact, and we can think of ourselves, and it's had an impact on other members of the PBI staff as well, who normally would be out doing other things that require interacting with other people. So, I'm pretty fortunate in this regard, but I think also if we look beyond that, we're all kind of fortunate that we again have seen that societies in the world are willing to look to evidence, to scientific evidence about what needs to be done to solve a major problem. And if we look to scientific evidence, we will see that we can solve the global warming problem in time to save polar bears. And if we do that, will benefit the rest of life on Earth, including ourselves.
Steve, you've given us so much food for thought just in the last half an hour. Do you have any final thoughts to leave us with and to give us a sense of what we've learned today going forward?
Well, I think that if we don't act, we're going to be in trouble. The climates will change to the point where it's going to be very difficult for people in many parts of the world to even raise their own food. And in fact, we're already seeing some of that. The converse of that is that we know, scientists have shown us what we need to do to halt global warming in time to prevent the most severe outcomes. And I think that this broadcast and the demonstration of people around the world with regard to the coronavirus have shown us that there is a pathway forward, that we can change the path that we've been on for the last many decades and head in a much better direction. And with the help of the viewers today, with the help of the other people who have long time been supporters of Polar Bears International and other conservation efforts, we will get there.
Thank you so much, Dr. Amstrup, and thank you to all of you for joining us today. If you have the ability to give, we hope you will become a supporter of Polar Bears International. And for those of you who have become pledge donors today, we will also send you this awesome Vote for Polar Bears sticker. We understand it is a challenging time for people around the world right now, and we appreciate your care and interest in this magnificent species. So on behalf of Polar Bears International, I want to thank you for joining us today. This is CK Sweat signing off from Brooklyn, New York. Stay safe and keep in touch.
Thank you.